The dust of Redemption Creek tasted of failure. Trudy knew the flavor well. It was the same grit that had coated her tongue the day she buried her husband on the trail, the same ash that had settled in her lungs when the wagon master told her she couldn't ride on without a man to vouch for her. Here, the dust was finer, ground from red dirt and shattered hopes, and it clung to the hem of her patched dress like a shroud. She had been in this town for 2 months, a ghost haunting the laundry tubs behind the mercantile, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap and other people's grime. The women of the town paid her in slivers of coin and pity, their eyes sliding past her as if she were a fence post. She was a widow, which was a tragedy, but a poor one, which was an inconvenience. Her world had shrunk to the rhythm of scrubbing and wringing, the scent of wood smoke and damp cotton. She slept on a cot in a storage room that smelled of dried beans and mice, her only possession of value the worn quilt her mother had made. Every evening she would sit on the back step, watching the sun bleed out over the jagged peaks, and feel a loneliness so vast it felt like another person sitting beside her. The town existed in a low hum of activity she was not part of. Men clattered in and out of the saloon, their spurs ringing on the boardwalk. Wives gathered at the mercantile, their conversations a soft murmur she could never quite catch. She was invisible, a necessary function but not a person, and some days, the silence of her life was a roar in her ears. Today, the hum had become a buzz. It started in the morning, a frantic energy that even reached her little corner of the world. Jed, the boy who swept the mercantile floors, had burst into her laundry space, eyes wide. "It's Mr. Dutch's mares," he'd panted. "The gray ones, spooked by a cougar up on the ridge, broke the fence and run clean off." Trudy stilled, a wet shirt dripping in her hands. She knew the mares. She had seen Dutch Calloway ride through town on one of them, a magnificent dapple gray that moved like poured silver. They were his pride, the foundation of his Triple Cross Ranch, the largest and most powerful holding in the territory. Dutch himself was a man carved from the same hard land as his ranch. He was tall and broad, with a face that looked like it had been set in stone years ago and had not softened since. The town respected him, feared him even. He had built an empire from nothing, but the cost had been steep. Whispers said he'd lost his wife in childbirth and had never spoken her name again, sealing that part of himself away like a tomb. He moved through the world with a chilling competence, a man who commanded but did not connect. The buzz grew louder as the day wore on. Ranch hands from the Triple Cross thundered through town, their faces grim. Men gathered in knots on the street, their voices low and serious. The loss of those mares wasn't just a financial blow to Dutch, it was an insult to his power, a crack in the fortress he had built around himself. By midday, the entire town had assembled in front of the sheriff's office. Dutch stood on the top step, his presence silencing the crowd without a word. His face was a mask of cold fury. $100, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a thrown knife. To the man who brings them back, all four, unharmed. A murmur went through the crowd. $100 was a fortune, more than most men in Redemption Creek saw in a year. But then came the shaking heads, the doubtful glances. These weren't just any horses. They were half wild, bred for speed and stamina. If they had truly run for the high country, spooked and scattered, finding them would be hard. Bringing them back would be next to impossible. The men looked at each other, weighing the reward against the futility of the task. No one stepped forward. Trudy stood at the edge of the crowd, hidden behind the bulk of the blacksmith. She had finished her laundry for the day, and the commotion had drawn her out. She listened to the men's excuses, their talk of canyons and cougars, of how the mares would be halfway to the next territory by now. They spoke of ropes and breaking them, of forcing them back. Her hands, resting on the worn fabric of her skirt, curled into fists. They didn't understand. You couldn't force a terrified animal. You had to listen to it. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her father, a man with a quiet touch, standing in a field of tall grass, making a low, soft sound in his throat. A wild colt, skittish and afraid, had lifted its head, its ears twitching. He had taught her the language of horses, the way they spoke with the flick of an ear, the shift of a hip, the tension in a neck. He had taught her that patience was stronger than rope, and trust was a better bridle than leather. That knowledge was the only thing her husband's gambling debts hadn't taken from her. Before she knew what she was doing, she was moving. She pushed through the crowd, the men parting before her with surprised looks. She felt their eyes on her patched dress, her worn-out boots. She walked to the bottom of the steps where Dutch stood, a remote and powerful figure looking down at the town he owned. She stopped, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and lifted her chin. "I'll do it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the sudden hush, it carried like a bell. "I'll bring them back." A ripple of disbelief, then outright laughter spread through the crowd. The blacksmith guffawed. Mrs. Gable, the town's chief gossip, pressed a hand to her mouth to hide a smirk. The idea was absurd. A laundress, a slip of a woman with nothing to her name, proposing to do what a dozen seasoned cowboys wouldn't even attempt. Dutch's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed on her. He didn't laugh. He looked at her as if she were a strange insect he'd found on his boot. "You?" he said, the single word dripping with contempt. Trudy's face burned, but she held his gaze. She would not flinch. She had been dismissed her whole life. This was nothing new. "Yes," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it had. "I know horses. I can track them. I will have your mares back in the home pasture before dark." The whole town heard her say it. The words hung in the air, a public, impossible promise. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned, expectant silence. They were waiting for Dutch to tear her down, to send her scurrying back to her laundry tubs with a harsh word. He stared at her for a long moment. He saw the frayed collar of her dress, the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes. But he also saw something else, something he hadn't seen in anyone's face in a long time. A certainty that had nothing to do with arrogance. It was a quiet, unshakable conviction. It unsettled him. It was the only reason he didn't send her away. "The whole town heard you, Mrs." He let the name hang, a subtle reminder of her anonymity. "Trudy," she supplied, her voice steady. "Trudy Mayhew." "Fine, Mrs. Mayhew," he said, a cynical twist to his lips. "Before dark." He turned his back on her then, a clear dismissal, and walked into the sheriff's office. The sound of his spurs, a final, sharp punctuation. The crowd began to break apart, buzzing with the sheer audacity of it. Trudy was left standing alone, the weight of her promise settling on her shoulders like a yoke. She had just wagered the only thing she had left, her dignity, in front of the entire town. Now she had to make good on it. She didn't ask for a horse. The men would have given her some broken-down nag and called it charity. Instead, she walked. She went back to her little room, changed into her husband's old trousers and a sturdy shirt, and filled a small canteen with water. She took no rope, no bridle, just herself. As she walked out of town, heading for the broken fence on the ridge, she could feel the eyes of Redemption Creek on her back. They were watching her go, every man, woman, and child expecting her to fail. Let them watch. The trail was easy to find at first. The 4 mares had torn through the fence line and crashed through the underbrush in a panic. Their tracks were deep, chaotic gouges in the earth. Any fool could follow this. But Trudy wasn't looking at the tracks. She was reading the story they told. She saw where the lead mare, the big dapple gray, had stumbled, where another had shied from a rock formation. They were running blind, not towards anything, but away. The cougar scent would be driving them, but fear was their master now. She walked for over an hour, climbing steadily into the rolling pine-studded hills. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine resin and dry earth. The sun beat down, but a cool breeze offered relief. The chaotic tracks began to settle into a more rhythmic pattern. The initial panic was fading, but they were still moving fast. She found a place where they had stopped to drink from a small creek, their prints clustered and calmer. She knelt, dipping her fingers in the mud. Still damp. They couldn't be more than an hour ahead. Instead of following the creek bed, which wound down into a steep-sided arroyo, she stopped and listened. Not with her ears, but with a deeper sense. She closed her eyes and pictured the mares. Frightened, leaderless without a human, they trusted. They would seek high ground for safety, but also shelter. A box canyon? A wooded mesa? She remembered her father's voice. Think like the horse, Trudy. Where does safety feel like? She ignored the obvious trail and cut west, up a steep, rocky incline. The climb was grueling. Her lungs burned and sweat trickled down her temples, carving clean paths through the dust on her skin. She used her hands to pull herself up over ledges, her palms scraping against the rough stone. At the top, she found herself on a wide, flat mesa, dotted with juniper trees and patches of hardy grass. And there, in the shade of a rock outcropping, were the mares. They weren't grazing. They stood huddled together, their heads up, ears swiveling nervously. The dapple-gray lead mare stood slightly apart, her flanks still trembling. They saw her the moment she cleared the rise, and a fresh wave of panic rippled through them. The lead mare snorted, stamping a hoof, ready to bolt again. Trudy froze. She did not walk towards them. She sank to the ground, making herself small and unthreatening. She sat cross-legged, her hands resting loosely in her lap, and she waited. She didn't look directly at them, instead focusing on a point of rock just to their left. She began to hum. It was a low, tuneless sound, the same sound her father had made all those years ago. It was a sound that meant peace, a sound that said, "I am not a threat." The sun crawled across the sky. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. The mares watched her, their nostrils flaring, testing the air. The lead mare snorted again, but it was less a warning and more a question. Trudy kept humming, her body relaxed, her breathing slow and even. Finally, the lead mare took a hesitant step forward, then another. She lowered her head, her ears still flicking back and forth, but the terror was leaving her eyes, replaced by curiosity. Trudy didn't move. She waited for the mare to come to her. The horse approached slowly, cautiously, until her soft nose was just inches from Trudy's shoulder. The mare breathed in her scent, a long, deep inhale. Trudy slowly, deliberately, lifted a hand and held it out, palm up. The mare nudged it with her nose, the touch as soft as velvet. Trudy began to speak, her voice a low murmur. "There now. It's all right. No one's going to hurt you. You're safe now." She didn't know that she was being watched. High on the ridge opposite the mesa, Dutch Calloway sat his black stallion, a spyglass to his eye. He had followed her. He hadn't believed she could do it, but he couldn't stomach the thought of her dying on his account, lost in the canyons. He had expected to find her wandering aimlessly, or worse. He had not expected this. He watched, mesmerized, as she gentled his prize mare with nothing but her voice and her stillness. He had seen the best horsebreakers in the territory work, men who used force and fear. What he was witnessing was something else entirely. It was like watching a secret language being spoken, a silent conversation between woman and animal. When the dapple gray finally lowered her head and allowed Trudy to stroke her neck, Dutch slowly lowered his spyglass, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It felt like wonder. The other 3 mares, taking their cue from their leader, had relaxed. They began to graze, their tails swishing in the late afternoon light. Trudy rose slowly to her feet. The lead mare didn't shy away. Trudy turned and began to walk back the way she had come. She didn't look back. She didn't call or whistle. She just walked. After a moment's hesitation, a soft whicker, and the sound of hooves on dry grass, she knew they were following. The sun was a fiery orange ball kissing the horizon when she walked them through the main gate of the Triple Cross Ranch. The ranch hands, gathered in the yard, fell silent, their mouths agape. They stared at the 4 pristine mares trailing behind the dusty, exhausted woman as if she were a mirage. She led them into the home pasture, unlatched the gate, and watched as they trotted peacefully to the water trough. Her job was done. She turned, every muscle in her body screaming in protest, and saw Dutch standing on the porch of the main house. He had been waiting. She walked towards him, her steps even, her face betraying none of the bone-deep weariness she felt. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, the same way she had in town, and looked up at him. The last rays of sunlight caught in her hair, turning the stray strands to gold. "Before dark, Mr. Dutch," she said, her voice raspy with thirst. "A promise is a debt. I mean to pay it." He came down the steps, stopping directly in front of her. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch heavy with coin. He held it out to her. $100, he said. His voice was different now. The cold edge was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. Respect, perhaps. Trudy looked at the pouch, then back at his face. She pushed it gently away. "I'll take a proper job, if you're offering one," she said. It was another gamble, another audacious move. But she was tired of washing other people's clothes. She was tired of being invisible. "Your stud, the black one. He's got fear in his eyes. Someone's been rough with him. I can fix that. I'm worth more than a one-time payment." Dutch was stunned into silence. No one spoke to him this way. No one made demands. They took what he offered and were grateful. But this woman, she had shown him a skill he couldn't buy, and now she was naming her own price. He looked past her, at the mares drinking peacefully, then back at her steady, challenging gaze. He saw not a grifter, but a woman who knew her own value, something he suspected the world had tried very hard to make her forget. "There's a line cabin, down by the creek," he said after a long moment. "It's small, but it's dry. Be at the stables at sunrise. We'll see what you can do." He turned and walked back into the house without another word, leaving her standing alone in the twilight. She hadn't been dismissed this time. She had been hired. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a combination of exhaustion and relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees. She had a place. It wasn't much, but for the first time since her husband died, it felt like she was standing on solid ground. The line cabin was more than she could have hoped for. It was a single, sturdy room with a stone fireplace, a proper bed frame, and a window that looked out over the whispering creek. Compared to her storage room in town, it was a palace. Dutch had left a stack of firewood by the door and a side of bacon and a sack of flour on the small table. It was a transaction, not a kindness, she told herself. But as she swept the floor that first night, the scent of pine and clean wood replacing the smell of dust and sorrow, it felt like a kindness all the same. Working at the Triple Cross was a new kind of life. The ranch was a world unto itself, a sprawling kingdom of grass and cattle, ruled by Dutch's unyielding will. The ranch hands watched her with suspicion. They were used to a world of muscle and force, and her quiet ways with the horses unsettled them. They called her the horse witch behind her back, the words a mix of scorn and grudging awe. Trudy ignored them. Her focus was on the animals, particularly the black stud Diablo. Dutch had been right. The horse was full of fear. He was a magnificent animal, powerful and intelligent, but he flinched from every touch, his eyes rolling back to show the whites. Trudy spent the first week just sitting in his corral, talking to him, letting him get used to her presence. She brought him apples, held them out on a flat palm, and waited for him to take them. She never used a rope, never tried to corner him. She was teaching him that her hands were not for hitting. Dutch watched her. He would stand at the far end of the corral, leaning against the fence, ostensibly checking on his stock. But his eyes were always on her. He saw the infinite patience, the gentleness that seemed to radiate from her. He saw Diablo, a horse that had injured two of his best men, begin to soften under her care. The stud started to nicker when she approached, to nudge her pockets, looking for a treat. Dutch had built his entire life on the principles of control and strength. Trudy operated on a different principle entirely: trust. And it was working in a way his methods never could. One afternoon she was working with Diablo, trying to get him to accept a saddle blanket on his back. He was tense, trembling, the memory of past pain making him skittish. Dutch walked into the corral, his spurs silent in the thick dust. "He's fighting the memory," Dutch said, his voice quiet. Trudy didn't look up. "Some things can't be broken with a rope," she murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "They have to be gentled." Dutch came to stand beside her. He was so close she could smell the scent of leather and clean sweat that clung to him. "Show me," he said. She guided his hand to the stud's shoulder. "Not a command," she whispered. "A conversation. Feel that tremor? That's the fear talking. You just have to stand here. Let him feel your calm until his story is done." His large, calloused hand rested beside hers on the horse's powerful shoulder. For a moment, their fingers brushed. A jolt, sharp and unexpected as a spark from a forge, shot up Trudy's arm. She caught her breath. She glanced up at him and found him already looking at her, his expression unreadable. The air thickened, charged with a meaning that had nothing to do with the horse. Diablo, sensing the shift, grew still beneath their hands, his trembling easing. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, a silent, fragile thing, until one of the ranch hands called Dutch's name from the fence line, shattering it. Dutch pulled his hand back, as if burned, and cleared his throat, his face once more a cold, impenetrable mask. "See that you get it done," he said, his voice harsh, and strode away. But Trudy had felt it. Beneath the ice, there was fire. The whispers in town grew louder. The story of the laundress and the runaway mares had become a local legend, and her new position at the Triple Cross fueled the gossip. Elsbeth Monroe, the daughter of the neighboring Rocking M rancher, made it her business to stoke the flames. Elsbeth had considered Dutch her intended since they were children, a fact everyone knew but Dutch himself seemed oblivious to. She saw Trudy not just as a rival, but as an insult. "She's a common grifter," Elsbeth would say, her voice carrying across the mercantile. "Playing on his grief. A man like Dutch Calloway doesn't hire a nobody to tend his prize stock unless she's got him bewitched." Trudy felt the chill of the town's suspicion whenever she had to ride in for supplies. Women who had once given her pity now gave her looks of pure venom. They saw her in her clean trousers and sturdy boots, no longer the pathetic laundrywoman, and their resentment was a palpable thing. She was an outsider who had risen too high, too fast. She had broken the unspoken rules of their world. The slow burn of attraction between her and Dutch continued in small, stolen moments. A cup of coffee he left on her cabin's porch rail before dawn. The way his eyes would find hers across the dusty ranch yard and hold for a second too long. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in with terrifying speed. Trudy was out in a far pasture checking on a pregnant mare. The sky opened up, unleashing a torrent of rain and hail. She managed to get the mare into the shelter of a small ravine just as Dutch appeared on his stallion, his face etched with worry. He didn't speak. He dismounted, took off his heavy oilskin coat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The coat was warm from his body and smelled of him. "Come on," he grunted, helping her onto his horse, then swinging up behind her. The ride back was silent, the only sounds the drumming rain and the steady beat of the horse's hooves. She was pressed against his chest, his arms around her to hold the reins. She could feel the solid, steady rhythm of his heart against her back. It was the safest she had felt in years. When they reached her cabin, he helped her down. For a moment, his hands lingered on her waist. "You're a damn fool for being out in this," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. But his eyes told a different story. They were dark, with a need that terrified and thrilled her. He released her abruptly and rode off into the deluge, leaving her shivering on her porch, though not from the cold. The kneading scared him. Trudy could see it in the way he started to avoid her, the way he would bark orders and then retreat into the cold silence he wore like armor. He had built walls around his heart to keep the pain out, and she, with her quiet ways and steady gaze, was dismantling them brick by brick. He was the most powerful man she had ever met, but she was beginning to see the truth. He was also the most broken. And the thought that she might be the one to heal him was a terrifying, beautiful thing. Elsbeth Monroe saw the connection too, and it festered in her like a poison. She could not abide the thought of a nameless, penniless widow capturing the man she considered her birthright. If the town's gossip wasn't enough to drive Trudy out, Elsbeth decided she would have to provide a more potent reason. She sent a man she trusted, a former ranch hand her father had fired for dishonesty, to ride east. He was to dig into Trudy Mayhew's past, and if he couldn't find any dirt, he was to invent it. The man returned weeks later with a story. Part truth, part vicious fabrication. Trudy's late husband, Frank Mayhew, had indeed been a gambler. He had left a trail of debts and angry men from Ohio to the territories. This much was true. But Elsbeth's man added a cruel twist, that Trudy had been his accomplice, a honey trap used to lure men into crooked card games. He claimed she had a warrant for her arrest in Missouri, that she was a wanted woman who had fled west to find a new, rich mark. Elsbeth now had her weapon. She didn't confront Trudy directly. She was more cunning than that. She went to her father, and then to other prominent town figures, presenting her evidence with a mask of grave concern. "I'm only worried for Dutch," she'd say, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He is so alone, so vulnerable since his dear Clara passed. This woman, she is a predator. She is taking advantage of his good heart." The story was perfectly crafted to play on Dutch's known history. He had been betrayed in business once before, by a partner who had nearly ruined him. The idea that he was being fooled again, this time by a woman, was a potent and humiliating narrative. The poison spread quickly. It confirmed every suspicion the town already held. The whispers became bold statements. The resentful ranch hands at the Triple Cross grew more insolent, deliberately misunderstanding Trudy's instructions regarding the horses. One of them, a man named Cole, even spat on the ground near her boots when she told him to change a horse's feed. She felt the tide turning against her, an invisible wall of hostility rising around her. The worst part was the change in Dutch. He grew more distant than ever, his face a grim, unreadable slate. The small moments of connection vanished. He no longer sought her out in the corral, no longer left coffee on her porch. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and formal. She could see the battle raging behind his eyes. He wanted to believe in her, the woman who calmed his horses and quieted the storm in his own soul. But the ghost of his past betrayal, now given fresh life by Elsbeth's lies, was a powerful enemy. He was terrified of being made a fool of again. His trust, once broken, had mended into a fragile, brittle thing, and Elsbeth's story was a hammer blow. Trudy felt her heart ache with a pain that was sharper than grief. She had started to feel like she belonged, that she had found a place where her own quiet strength was seen and valued. Now it was all turning to ash. She was once again the outsider, the unwanted woman. Every averted gaze, every whispered comment was a fresh wound. She kept her head high, focusing on her work, pouring all her love and attention into the animals who did not judge or lie. She had gentled Diablo, who now followed her like a shadow, a testament to her skill that no one could deny. Yet they did. They saw her power over the horse not as a gift, but as proof of her witchcraft, her unnatural influence. The threat hanging in the air finally coalesced at the town's annual Founders' Day social. It was held in the newly built town hall, a rare occasion where ranchers and townfolk mingled. Dutch, as the town's most important citizen, was expected to attend. He had told Trudy, in a clipped, impersonal tone, that her work with the horses had earned her a place there. She knew it was a test. Her attendance would be a statement. She spent the day filled with a nervous dread, but she refused to hide. She put on her one good dress, a simple blue cotton she had mended a dozen times, and walked into that hall with her back straight. The room fell silent when she entered. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The hostility was a physical force, pressing in on her from all sides. She saw Elsbeth standing near the punch bowl, surrounded by her friends, a triumphant smirk on her face. Trudy's eyes searched for Dutch. He was standing by the fireplace, talking to the sheriff, his back partially to her. He saw her. She knew he did. But he didn't move. He didn't acknowledge her. He just continued his conversation, his shoulders rigid. That was the first blow. The second came from Elsbeth. She detached herself from her group and glided towards Trudy, her silk dress rustling. "Why, Mrs. Mayhew," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "How brave of you to show your face. I would think a woman with a warrant for her arrest in Missouri would prefer to keep to the shadows." A collective gasp went through the room. This was it. The public accusation. Trudy felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a lie," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it?" Elsbeth's eyes glittered with malice. "I have a sworn statement from a man who knew you and your husband back in Sedalia. A Mr. Finch, in fact." She gestured to a greasy-looking man standing nervously by the door. "He's right here. He can tell everyone how you helped your husband cheat honest men at cards." All eyes turned to Trudy, then to the man by the door, then to Dutch. This was his ranch, his employee, his something. The entire town held its breath, waiting for him to act, to defend her, to denounce the accusation, to do something. Trudy's gaze locked with Dutch's across the room. She saw the torment in his face, the war between his heart and his history. She sent him a silent plea, a desperate appeal to the man who had wrapped his coat around her in the storm, whose hand had felt so right next to hers on Diablo's flank. "Please," her eyes begged. "See me." He looked at her, and for a heart-stopping second she thought he would move, that he would cross the room and stand by her side. But then, the old, cold mask slammed down. The memory of his past betrayal, the public humiliation he had once endured, was too strong. Fear won. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head and turned back to the sheriff, deliberately turning his back on her. His silence was a louder noise than any gunshot she had ever heard. It was a public execution of her character, and he was the one who had let the axe fall. The room erupted in a cacophony of righteous murmurs. Elsbeth smiled, a victor claiming her prize. Trudy felt a cold hollowness spread through her chest. The fight went out of her. There was nothing left to fight for. Without his belief, she had nothing. She turned, her head held high by sheer brittle pride, and walked out of the town hall. She didn't run. She walked with a measured, deliberate pace, each step an agony. She didn't look back. The cool night air hit her face, but it couldn't quench the fire of humiliation that burned in her cheeks. She walked past the lights of the town, past the sound of the fiddle starting up again inside the hall, and back towards the dark, lonely road that led to the Triple Cross. She knew what she had to do. There was no place for her here. There never had been. Back in the small cabin that had started to feel like home, she moved with a numb efficiency. She folded the mother's quilt, her hands stroking the worn fabric one last time. She packed her few belongings into the same small satchel she had arrived with. There wasn't much to pack. On the table, she placed the money Dutch had paid her for her work. Every last coin. She would not be accused of taking anything that wasn't hers. She didn't write a note. His public silence had been all the farewell she needed. With a final heartbreaking look at the small, sturdy room, she slipped out into the darkness. She wouldn't even take a horse. She would walk away, just as she had walked in, with nothing but the dust on her boots and the unyielding strength in her spine. Dutch stood by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The sounds of the party faded to a dull roar in his ears. He had watched Trudy walk out, had seen the proud, straight line of her back, and every instinct had screamed at him to go after her. But he had remained frozen, paralyzed by the ghosts of his past. He had let his fear of being a fool make him a coward. The congratulations of Elspeth's father, the approving nods from the town elders, all felt like ash in his mouth. He had protected his reputation at the cost of his soul. He left the party without a word to anyone and walked back to his empty house. The silence of the large rooms mocked him. He thought of the quiet competence of Trudy's hands, the sound of her voice gentling a terrified animal, the way she had looked at him in the rain, wrapped in his coat. He had been more alive in those small moments than he had been in the 10 years since his wife died. She had been a quiet spring in the desert of his life, and he had just let the sand bury her. He couldn't sleep. Before dawn, he found himself walking towards her cabin, drawn by a desperate, foolish hope. He saw the cold, dark window, and his heart sank. He pushed open the door. The room was neat, barren, and empty. The bed was stripped, the hearth cold, and on the table a neat stack of coins glinted in the pre-dawn light. The returned money was a final damning judgment. It wasn't the act of a grifter. It was the act of a woman of immense pride, a woman he had grievously wronged. The emptiness of the cabin hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just lost an employee. He had lost the one person who had breached the walls of his frozen heart. He finally understood. The risk of being hurt again was nothing compared to the desolation of this emptiness. His caution hadn't saved him. It had damned him. A sudden furious energy seized him. He would not let this be the end of the story. He strode to the stables, his long steps eating up the ground. He didn't saddle his own stallion. Instead, he walked to the pasture where the gray mares were kept. He gave a low whistle. The dapple gray lead mare, the one Trudy had brought back from the brink, lifted her head and trotted directly to him, nuzzling his hand. It was Trudy's trust the horse was responding to, not his. He put a simple bridle on her and swung onto her bare back. He would find Trudy, and he would use the very symbol of her gift to do it. As he rode out, a frantic shout came from the main corral. He turned to see his foreman, Bill, waving his arms wildly. "Mr. Dutch, it's Diablo. That fool Cole went in with a whip, and the horse went crazy. He smashed the gate, got Elspeth Monroe pinned against the stable wall." Dutch's blood ran cold. He wheeled the mare around and galloped toward the chaos. The scene at the main stable was terrifying. Diablo, his eyes rolling in sheer terror and rage, was rearing and striking, the splintered remains of the gate scattered around him. The ranch hands were frozen. too afraid to approach. And cowering against the wall, her face a mask of horror, was Elsbeth. The horse was a breath away from killing her. Dutch knew ropes and force would only make it worse, might drive the panicked stud to trample her. There was only one person who could stop this. "Where did she go?" he roared at Bill. "Which road?" "The east road, towards the pass," Bill yelled back over the stud, screaming. Dutch didn't hesitate. He spurred the gray mare, flying out of the ranch yard like a man possessed. He rode not because Trudy was helpless, but because he was. Because without her, his world was falling apart. He rode with a single, desperate prayer in his heart. He found her an hour later, a small, determined figure walking steadily along the dusty road. He slid off the mare's back before the horse had even stopped moving. Trudy turned, her face pale and drawn, her eyes showing no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness. "Trudy," he said, his voice raw. He had 1,000 things to say, apologies and explanations, but they all choked in his throat, so he said the only thing that mattered. "I was wrong. I was a coward. Please, come home." Before she could answer, the thunder of another horse approached. It was a young ranch hand, his face white with panic. "Mr. Dutch, it's Elsbeth. Diablo's got her cornered. Bill says only Mrs. Trudy can stop him." Trudy's eyes met Dutch's. In that moment, the personal pain between them was eclipsed by the immediate crisis. He saw the conflict in her face, the urge to keep walking, to leave them all to the mess they had made. But he also saw the deep well of compassion that was at the core of her being. She looked at the frantic boy, then at the gray mare she had rescued, and her choice was made. She couldn't let an animal, driven mad by cruelty, be destroyed. She couldn't let a person, even Elsbeth, be killed. "Help me up," she said to Dutch. He cupped his hands for her foot and swung her up onto the mare's back, then vaulted up behind her. They raced back towards the ranch, the wind tearing at them, two people bound together by a crisis that was both of their making and neither of their fault. When they arrived, the scene was even worse. Diablo was slick with sweat, his rage turning to exhausted panic. Elsbeth was weeping hysterically. The air was thick with the smell of fear. Dutch slid to the ground. "Clear the yard," he commanded his men, his voice ringing with its old authority. "All of you, back to the bunkhouse. Now." The men scattered, relieved. Elsbeth, seeing her chance, scrambled away from the wall and fled. Soon, the yard was empty except for Dutch, standing by the fence, and Trudy, who slowly slid off the mare's back and walked, alone, toward the terrified stud. She didn't rush. She walked with that same calm, deliberate pace she had used on the mesa. She began to hum, that low, soothing, tuneless sound. Diablo stopped rearing. He stood trembling, his head low, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He watched her approach, his ears twitching. "It's all right, boy," she crooned, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "It's just me. It's all right. The fear is done now. The story is over." She walked right up to the massive, quivering animal. She didn't reach for his bridle. She laid a hand, flat and gentle, on his sweat-soaked neck. The stud flinched, but he didn't pull away. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of release that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He leaned his great head against her shoulder, and she just stood there, stroking him, murmuring to him, her quiet strength absorbing all his terror. She had saved him. She had saved them all. The entire ranch had witnessed it. They had seen the truth of her gift, the undeniable evidence of her character. She had not used witchcraft. She had used kindness. Dutch walked slowly into the yard. He stopped beside her, beside the now calm horse that trusted her implicitly. He looked at her, his face stripped bare of all its armor, his heart in his eyes for all to see. In front of the foreman and the hands who were now peering from the bunkhouse, in front of the whole world of his ranch, he made his choice. He reached out and put his hand on the small of her back, a simple public gesture of possession and protection. "Bill," he called out, his voice clear and strong. The foreman appeared in the bunkhouse doorway. "From now on," Dutch said, his eyes never leaving Trudy's face, "Mrs. Mayhew's word on horses is law on this ranch. Same as mine." He had not only defended her, he had given her power. He had torn up the unwritten laws of the town and written a new one. She belonged. A month later, the autumn sun warmed the porch of the line cabin. The whispers in town had died, replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. Elsbeth Monroe and her father had left on an extended trip back east after Cole, the abusive ranch hand, had confessed under Dutch's cold questioning that Elsbeth had paid him to toughen up the stud. The truth of her malice, laid bare, had been more damning than any accusation she had leveled at Trudy. Trudy sat on the top step, mending a bridle, the scent of curing leather pleasant in the air. Diablo grazed peacefully in the corral nearby, a living testament to her patience. She was no longer just an employee, she was the heart of the ranch's stables, her quiet authority absolute. She heard the sound of hammering and looked up. For the past week, Dutch had been spending his evenings at her cabin. Not talking much, just being there. He had been building something on the side of her small house. Now he was putting the finishing touches on it. He stepped back to admire his work. A small, sturdy extension with its own window and a door, shelves lining the inside wall. He walked over and sat down on the step beside her. He didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the sun begin to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. "It's for your herbs and things," he said finally, his voice quiet. "For your doctoring. A place to keep it all." It wasn't just a room. It was a foundation. It was a promise. It was a wall torn down from his own house and used to build a home for her. It was his heart, offered not in words, but in wood and nails and sweat. Trudy put down the bridle and looked at the new room, then at the powerful, quiet man beside her. The man who had been closed off and broken was now open, vulnerable, building a future with his own two hands. The woman who had arrived with nothing, dismissed and alone, was now loved and respected, rooted in a place she had earned. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in her own. His fingers closed around hers, a perfect fit. They sat there in the warm twilight, in the comfortable silence that says more than words ever could. The frontier was still wild, the world still dangerous, but here, on this porch, with their hands intertwined and the horses grazing peacefully in the dusk, they had both found their way home. They had rescued each other.